Imagine you are a hunter-gatherer living roughly 13,000 years ago in a cave in what will one day become Israel. After a long day of trekking through wild brush, your feet are aching, and your only solace is that you are surrounded by people you actually like, which, let's be honest, is rarer than we think even today. Suddenly, someone in your tribe stumbles upon a handful of wild grain that's been sitting forgotten in a wet stone mortar for a little too long. It smells weird. The surface is bubbling, pulsing like some mysterious, breathing biological entity. To any sensible primate with a basic survival instinct, this pungent, gooey liquid is a screaming red flag. Stay away if you want to avoid fatal food poisoning. Yet, for reasons that defy all evolutionary logic, someone decides to pick it up and chug it. That person is quite possibly the most important human being who ever lived. Because that single moment of magnificent, reckless curiosity set humanity on a trajectory that changed absolutely everything. Agriculture, religion, writing, and the entire structural architecture of modern human society. But the real question is, were humans even biologically designed to handle alcohol in the first place? For most animals on Earth, consuming ethanol in any meaningful quantity leads to swift toxicity, liver failure, and a painful death. But you and your close primate relatives possess a secret weapon, an enzyme called alcohol dehydrogenase 4, or ADH4, which breaks down ethanol with astonishing efficiency. And here is the truth that should stop you in your tracks. This genetic mutation didn't appear when we invented wine, nor did it emerge with the dawn of agriculture. It appeared roughly 10 million years ago. Long before Homo sapiens or Homo erectus ever walked the earth, our bodies were already quietly preparing for a lifelong covenant with booze. This phenomenon was coined by UC Berkeley biologist Robert Dudley as one of the greatest names in scientific history, the Drunken Monkey Hypothesis. As our primate ancestors began transitioning from the trees to the forest floor, their primary calorie source was fruit. When fruit gets perfectly ripe, natural environmental yeasts consume its sugars, producing ethanol as a byproduct. That sharp scent of alcohol wasn't a warning sign. It was a biological beacon. It signaled, get over here fast. This fruit is at peak ripeness, maximum sweetness, packed with calories, and you need to eat it before someone else does. The ancestors who followed the scent of booze got more energy, survived longer, reproduced, and baked that exact preference straight into your nervous system today. Evolution's favoritism toward alcohol isn't just theoretical. Scientists proved it by studying wild, black-handed spider monkeys in Panama. The fruits they actively chose to eat regularly contained between 1% and 2% alcohol by volume, and their urine samples were packed with secondary metabolites of ethanol, proving they weren't just ingesting it, they were actively metabolizing it. Similarly, chimpanzees in the Ivory Coast routinely consume a diet of fermenting fruits that exposes them to the equivalent of 1 to 2 alcoholic drinks a day just by eating their normal food. Your ancient ancestors were technically catching a mild buzz in the jungle 10 million years ago without even trying. But moving from accidentally eating fermented fruit to deliberately brewing it is a monumental cognitive leap. It requires observation, memory, and the scientific capacity to replicate a complex biological process. The oldest archaeological evidence of intentional human brewing sits deep inside Raqefet Cave, near modern-day Haifa. This was a sacred burial site used by the Natufians, a socially complex population of semi-nomadic hunter-gatherers who lived 13,000 years ago. Inside this burial cave, a Stanford University team, led by archaeologist Li Lu, discovered large stone mortars coated with microscopic residues of starch and phytoliths. The chemical verdict was unambiguous. The Natufians were brewing beer. They did it through a sophisticated multi-step process, malting the wild wheat and barley by germinating it in water, mashing and heating it, and then letting it ferment via wild airborne yeasts. Let your brain short-circuit for a moment here. This completely predates agriculture. The Natufians weren't farmers. They didn't grow crops. They had to painstakingly forage for wild grains across the landscape. Yet, instead of using those precious calories to bake bread, they used them to brew beer for rituals honoring their dead. This discovery fueled one of the most fascinating debates in archaeology, the beer-before-bread hypothesis, championed by archaeologist Brian Hayden. Why would a free-roaming hunter-gatherer, living a perfectly successful mobile lifestyle, suddenly decide to settle down, break their back tilling hard soil, plant seeds, and wait months for them to grow? The trade-off wasn't for a dry loaf of bread, it was for a guaranteed, reliable supply of beer. Beer provided a calorie-dense beverage, safer than wild water sources, and it acted as the ultimate social lubricant for communal feasts, seasonal rites, and sacred transitions connecting the living to the dead. From the sacred caves of the Natufians, if we jump 4,000 years forward to the Neolithic era, around 7,000 BCE, the archaeological record of fermentation explodes globally from multiple, completely isolated directions. In the ancient village of Jiahu, in China's Yellow River Valley, molecular archaeologists, analyzing residues inside early pottery jars, discovered a remarkably complex, ancient cocktail. It was a fermented blend of rice, honey, hawthorn fruit, and wild grapes. Around the exact same period, in a small village called Gadatrili Gora in modern-day Georgia, archaeologists unearthed massive clay jars bearing the chemical signatures of grape fermentation dating back 8,000 years. These are the oldest confirmed drops of wine in the world. To this day, Georgians still make wine the traditional way, burying massive clay vessels called quevri into the earth, an unbroken tradition spanning 8 millennia. Even more striking, back in Jiahu 9,000 years ago, researchers discovered the earliest known evidence of mold-based fermentation starters. This is a highly advanced technique that uses specific fungi to break down complex grain starches before the yeast takes over. This method predates written records by thousands of years and is the direct ancestor of the exact processes used to make Japanese sake, Chinese baijiu, and Korean makgeolli today. Look at this geographic spread: China, Georgia, the Levant. These cultures were not in contact. They weren't trading recipes or ideas. They discovered fermentation entirely independently within the same window of human prehistory. What this tells us is extraordinary. Fermentation is not a one-time lucky accident. It is a human inevitability. Given grain, fruit, or honey, a sufficient amount of time, and basic curiosity, humans will figure out how to make alcohol every single time. As a species, we are fundamentally and incurably fermentation curious. If Neolithic cultures turned fermentation into an archaeological reality, ancient Mesopotamia, the land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, turned alcohol into a massive, bureaucratized state institution. This is the birthplace of writing, and it is no coincidence that some of the earliest things ever etched onto clay tablets were administrative records about beer. At the site of Godin Tepe in the Zagros Mountains of western Iran, chemists found calcium oxalate, a residue produced during beer fermentation, crystallized and perfectly preserved inside clay vessels, dating back to 3,500 BCE. But Mesopotamia didn't just drink beer. They integrated it into their economic infrastructure. Under the Sumerian and Babylonian systems, workers received daily rations of beer as a fundamental part of their wages. If you were a laborer building a temple, a scribe copying tablets, or a farmer digging irrigation canals, you were paid in beer. Average laborers received about 2 liters a day, while high-ranking officials received far more. Even the deceased were buried with beer rations, because the Sumerians saw no logical reason why death should interrupt a perfectly good happy hour. Beer was currency, medicine, religion, and the very fabric of social order. They loved beer so deeply that they welcomed a goddess into their pantheon exclusively to rule over it, Ninkasi, which translates magnificently to the lady who fills the mouth. Around 1800 BCE, an anonymous poet composed the hymn to Ninkasi. It is a religious masterpiece, a declaration of love, and depending on which scholars you ask, a step-by-step brewing recipe. Etched on 2 clay tablets, it details the malting of grain, the baking of it into a special bread called bapir, the soaking, the fermenting, and the filtering of the final golden liquid through woven baskets. In 1989, Fritz Maytag, founder of Anchor Brewing Company in San Francisco, actually attempted to recreate this 3,800-year-old recipe. The result? A beverage with a 3.5% ABV, tasting like a pleasant cross between champagne and dates. The recipe still worked perfectly across millennia. This obsession culminated with the Babylonians, who classified at least 70 distinct varieties of beer. And in the Code of Hammurabi, circa 1754 BCE, one of the oldest written legal codes in human history, the state stepped in with strict consumer protection laws for alcohol. If a tavern owner was caught watering down their product to cheat customers, the official legal punishment was being thrown into the river to drown. Humanity's first great written laws made sure nobody messed with the quality of a tavern pour. We have always known what truly matters. Crossing the desert into ancient Egypt, we find a similar story, but wrapped in a distinct system of social prestige. The workers who built the pyramids of Giza, who were free, well-fed laborers, not slaves, as modern Egyptology has firmly established, were sustained by a daily ration of thick, nutritious, low-alcohol emmer wheat beer. In a scorching climate where the Nile water could carry deadly waterborne pathogens, the natural antimicrobial properties of fermented beer made it a critical piece of public health infrastructure. It kept the workforce alive. But while beer was the fuel of the masses, wine was pure prestige. Wine was reserved for the elite, for high state ceremonies, for offerings to the gods, and for the burial chambers of the pharaohs. When archaeologists excavate royal Egyptian tombs, they find sealed wine jars, labeled not just with the vintage year and the specific vineyard of origin, but even with the name of the chief vintner responsible. These are the world's oldest designer wine labels, sitting in the dark for 3,000 years. The Egyptians credited the invention of beer to Osiris, the god of the dead and resurrection, viewing it as a pillar of civilization that elevated humans above beasts. There is a single golden thread running from the Natufian hunter-gatherers in their cave, through the painted pottery of Jiahu, to the clay tablets of Mesopotamia and the royal tombs of Egypt. At the dawn of civilization, alcohol is always bound to the sacred. Humans didn't invent alcohol to forget their problems after a hard day of prehistoric farming. They cultivated it to mark the moments that matter most: birth, death, harvest, prayer, and the binding of communities. The altered state of consciousness provided by a fermented beverage was understood by the ancients as a doorway, a deliberate stepping outside of the individual ego to touch something grander and connect with the collective tribe. So, the next time someone passes you a drink, take a moment to look at the liquid catching the light in your hand. That glass is connected through an uninterrupted chain of human curiosity, ritual, and survival, stretching back 13,000 years to a hunter-gatherer standing in a cave, tasting a strange, bubbling slurry and finding it against all odds magnificent. And behind that person stands 10 million years of monkeys in the jungle, following a sweet, sharp scent through the canopy and deciding every single time to walk toward it. We didn't stumble into alcohol by accident. We grew toward it the exact way a plant grows toward the light.